because good stories are curated. They are, by good storytellers. Good writers make a difference, and you cannot have enough money with a $50 million budget to write a number of stories that will keep players satisfied for more than, I would say, single-digit hundreds of hours. Single-digit hundreds of hours. And hundreds of hours sounds like a long time. I would praise that. If you have 100 hours of engaging and immersive story, I think that's amazing. But when we talk about MMORPGs, players don't play 100 hours. They don't. They play 1,000 hours, or 5,000 hours, or 10,000 hours. Players are, as Jostrife Hayes, who wears a vest, says, locusts. They consume everything in a game. They do. They consume everything and anything. Which means they don't just stop when it's healthy. They optimize the fun out of it. So they are going to go well past anything that's engaging and immersive. And if you do not want them to run out of content, you're going to need to have content that goes past engaging and immersive. Pride in chat has 1,300 days played in one single MMO. And there are still 29 people in the world that have more achievement points than Pride. So, what I'm having an issue with is that there is this celebration of the quality, and then there's this celebration of the quantity. And if you're celebrating both, I have never seen it where one does not suffer to give way to the other. Because the very second pillar is this reactive, living world. This reactive, amazing world. And for it to be a reactive and truly amazing world, that is something closer to EVE Online. And EVE Online does not have an engaging and immersive story. So to have a world that can tell deeper and more player-interacted stories than EVE Online, how are you going to take on Final Fantasy XIV in an engaging and immersive story? How do you do it? You can't. You cannot do both those things and do them both well. One of them or both of them are going to have to suffer. Because of the third thing. Because of player interaction. So when we ask, will this be this large variety, constantly given world? Well, if the world is going to be part of it, part of the narrative, through things like open world PvP, through things like zone ownership, through things like node development. Great. Great. But if the player interaction is going to be impressive because their individual place in this story is important, that counteracts this first one. Now that doesn't mean a game can't be good. It doesn't mean I'm not excited to play it. It doesn't mean it can't be important. The fact that something is not truly unique in a space, or the fact that something is not your unique experience, doesn't mean it's bad. Let's go look at games that have a predetermined outcome. Best MMO story. And I go look up stories for MMORPGs. The 14 stories, according to Game Rant, top one with stories, you're gonna have narrative-based MMOs show up. But you're talking about best storytelling, and EVE Online is doing that through players, real-life drama, as opposed to games like Guild Wars that is doing it through a personal story that's only yours. And that at the end of that story, every single player will take on the same Elder Dragon. And if that Elder Dragon dies, to you, it will die to the next player. And so every one of these games that any website, any person categorizes is making a unique story through either the reactive world or the narrative. Not both. It's just not both. You have either created a curated world that can allow games, stories to not accidentally end up boring and repetitive and not make sense, or you are ending up with a story that is well curated, but we're all going to have the same outcome. By the time you beat Endwalker in Final Fantasy XIV, we all finish on the same boss. All of us, together. You have the same final zone, with the same final events, ending in the same final outcome for every single player that has ever and will ever beat Endwalker on Final Fantasy XIV. And it is engaging, and it is immersive, and it can make you cry, and it can move you, and it can redefine your relationship with games, or the way you think about certain events of your past. It made me, the Binding Coil story made me tell stories online to you guys about reminding me of my grandfather. What it meant to me may have been totally different than what it meant to you. But there was no agency. There was nothing procedural. Which means the experience is not just not infinite. Let's assume that their experience is not infinite. It's not even a dozen ways to complete it. It's not even 2 ways to complete it. The Binding Coil's story in Final Fantasy XIV is likely my favorite narrative I have ever been told in any game, ever. Single player, multiplayer, D&D, video games, the Binding Coil story is likely the single highest caliber story for me that I have ever been told. But if you clear it for your first time today, you will have identical quest text and an identical outcome to me. It can be engaging and immersive, but it is not reactive. Not at all. And the reason that it is so engaging and so immersive is because they didn't allow me to accidentally do something that lowers the quality. They curated the living crap out of it. And so from there, we have this player agency, and there's this idea that every player is going to create their own way to play. But once again, in an MMORPG, this is intrinsically limited. So they start out by saying, we're going to have 8 classes. 8 classes. That's the amount of variety we're going to create. But those 8 classes are going to have 8 subclasses, the ability to subclass those 8, which are going to create a total of 64 builds. And that is where a huge chunk of the player agency comes from. A huge chunk is that I'm going to be able to go through these archetypes that they refer to. And that's going to give me a lot of player agency. The way I gear my character and the way I kit out my skills. So I have 64 builds. World of Warcraft has 39 and complains about balance as is. Guild Wars has 9 base classes, and each of those classes have 4 specializations, and each of those specializations has a wild amount of build variety in it, and they complain about balance. They have 36, but those 36 have choices. Final Fantasy has what? 17? Is that right? Final Fantasy, this is the number of builds. Every paladin is identical to every other paladin, every machinist to every other machinist. And we still had enormous drama flare up this last patch based on the fact that machinist was just not seen in clearing of the current content. So it's not infinite. Not because every player is a sweaty gamer that wants the most optimal experience, but because no player wants to suck. So ultimately, of these 64 builds, I can assure you, some builds at given patch cycles within certain types of content will be unbelievably rare, because they will be unbelievably bad. And some builds will be unbelievably popular, because they will be good. So every single class in here will have 8 sub-build options. So there will be 8 ways to play each of the 8 classes for a total of 64. But the top chunk of that will be wildly popular, and the bottom chunk will be wildly unpopular. Because we're in an MMO. You can play through Cyberpunk, and you can be bad if you want. You can play through an Elder Scrolls game and be bad. It's your call. You want to be God mode, you can be God mode. You want to be bad, you want to be bad. But the moment you have build variety, you have to tune it. Even in games like action RPGs, where they can allow classes to just become God mode, like Diablo and Path of Exiles, Wolcen. Ultimately, they still have to try to balance it. So the moment you try to balance it, you either homogenize the classes, or you just allow some classes to just be objectively better than others. So it's not a wide variety. It's not 64. It's 64 scratch-off. It's 64 attempts at valid builds, but some of those won't make the cut. Now, once again, this is not a dig on the game. It's just that I'm hearing people talk about a game that has not released as if it will not have the weaknesses that time and time and time again, companies with billion-dollar budgets that have a history of releasing MMORPG content day in and day out for years on end have continued to struggle with these problems. And there is this idea that a game that has not released, coming from a studio that has not released an MMORPG, is going to somehow do something that embarrasses the entire industry. There are people that believe this is going to be the greatest MMORPG, that their belief is that the MMO genre as a whole is dead, and that Ashes is going to save it. It is the city on the hill. But what I will tell you is that Final Fantasy's head developer and producer, Yoshi P, continually says, if you need a break from this game, take one. World of Warcraft says, we've made mistakes and we're listening. Guild Wars devs say, we've heard your feedback and we're hoping to continue to do better. Please be patient with us. And Steven has continually fed oxygen and fuel into this fire, which has made it, instead of a fringe group that live on that hill, has allowed it to build. And this is exactly what the marketing team surrounding No Man's Sky did, and it made it really hard for the devs. And I felt bad for the devs. But in this case, this is the guy leading the devs. And so I don't have anybody in my chat that likes Ashes of Creation because I haven't really talked that positively about the game. But I've said I want to play it and I want it to be good. I do. I want it to be good. I think it's important for MMOs in general that more MMOs come to the space and that they do a good job. If you want people to continue investing money in MMOs, the genre as a whole needs to be healthy. And that's good. But I don't see how this game can offer the variety of experiences that it's offering at the quality that it's offering it. So when he says that he can match, he's going to raise the quality of story that's being told in the genre, and he's going to have an enormous quantity on launch, that's already a red flag. And when he says that we're going to create a world that has more of a variety of experiences than any MMO on the market, that's already a red flag. And so when it comes to how MMOs, here is exact quotes from him. When it comes to how MMOs have been traditionally designed, most gamers are familiar with two distinct types of gameplay loops: the theme park and the sandbox. Okay? The theme park on this end is a bunch of individual rides, and when you get off the ride, someone else gets on, they have the exact same experience as you. You don't have to ride every ride in the park. Some games heavily encourage you to ride one ride. Final Fantasy XIV, for example, encourages you to try the story. World of Warcraft encourages you to try their PvE instanced content. Those are the big highlighter rides. They're on the billboard, they're in the trailer. And the sandbox, which is something like EVE Online, right? These more Valheim experiences where the player determines. There are games that blend these. There are. Brian likes to call them sand parks. It doesn't matter. There are games that blend these. But these two distinct gameplay loops are what defines the space. And most games get grouped into Group A or Group B. The problem with the theme park is that if there's no rides you want to ride, the game is boring. And so if I go to a theme park, it is Halloween today. If I go to a theme park today in my area, it is going to be heavily emphasized on haunted houses, as well as roller coasters. And if you don't like roller coasters and don't like haunted houses, it's a pretty crappy theme park experience pretty quickly. That's the downside. The upside is that those haunted houses and rides have been curated to be the best of what they can be. Or there's the sandbox, where I can build whatever I want out of sand. I can build a sand castle, I can dig a little moat around it, I could bury myself in the sand, whatever I want to do. But the downside of it is that a sandbox without direction, a sandbox without any direction whatsoever, is something that we are all familiar with. Okay? It is something that we can all picture in our heads. And it looks a lot like this. A game that I feel has theme park elements, rides you can ride if you choose to, but chooses to present them in a sandbox way, is Guild Wars 2. There is a beautifully told, fully voice-acted story that you don't have to do. There are curated raids that you don't have to do. There is geared variety and build variety that you don't have to do. There's PvP modes that you don't have to engage with. But it is regularly told to me by people that tried Guild Wars 2, I tried it and I got lost and I got bored and I didn't know what to do next. And so if you don't have somebody helping give you directions, and you are not a wildly driven or creative person on your own, a sandbox is incredibly dangerous. Because it can be a desert. And so you want that blending. And ideally, every theme park has at least one little pit that people can play in, and every sandbox has at least 1 or 2 rides to get you started. EVE Online has their whole secured space experience. Final Fantasy has their entire kind of RP-driven and their housing and island sanctuary stuff that they foster. Right? And so sandbox is where the words like infinite and procedural start to come up conversationally, because they're ubiquitous with my experience was different than anybody else's. So it feels like a unique little snowflake. A unique little snowflake. It feels like that. It feels infinite. And theme parks feel very, very static. But most games don't actually stay entirely in column A or column B. They're a little bit of one. And they're a little bit of two. But they tend to shift more towards one or the other. The vast majority of MMOs we've seen come and go in the gaming industry have been of the theme park variety. Now this is because, what do we see? If I go out to something like twitch.com, and I go here, and I go to browse, it default sorts the categories by viewers high to low. And they're getting better about this, searching things by recommended for me. And it starts to recognize that I like watching Final Fantasy and New World content and Guild Wars 2 content. This is what I like watching. This is what I enjoy. I don't know why it thinks I like Overwatch 2. Maybe they paid for that to be in there. Because I also like watching World of Warcraft and just chatting. I do. And so it pushes those to the top of my list. But if you leave it at high to low, then you very quickly see curated experiences rise to the top of MMORPGs specifically. World of Warcraft is mostly theme park. But it depends on like your definition of MMORPG. Lost Ark, very theme park-esque. It's very hard for sandbox games to rise to the top. And that's because sandbox games like EVE Online are not exciting moment to moment. They're not. They build to those moments. We thrive on the stories that are the craziest moments of EVE Online. And so as we scroll down and we see MMORPGs occasionally in the mix, they are mostly theme park. They absolutely are. And that's just on Twitch, but it's the same on every platform. Steam, they're sorted that way. YouTube, they're sorted by that way. So the vast majority of MMOs we've seen, there's a pivotal word there. We've seen come and go. The ones that hit my eyeballs, which means the ones I played and the ones that passed in front of my eyes, have been of the theme park variety. But that's true of the real world. I see way more marketing for theme parks than I do beaches. I see way more marketing for these curated experiences, going to the movies and watching the same thing as everybody else, instead of going hiking. going and watching a television show on Netflix, instead of getting into a hobby like woodworking. Theme parks are just easier to market because you're marketing one outcome as opposed to somebody's ability to have all the outcomes. Theme parks are just more marketable. So that doesn't mean the vast majorities of good MMOs or the vast majorities of impactful MMOs. The number of people who have ever heard of and played Dwarf Fortress in all of human history is probably less than 1 million people. And yet, Dwarf Fortress, as one of the best sandbox games of all time, has impacted an enormous number of games. There are a ton of games that have taken concepts and refined it to them, and those have become whole iterative genres. When you see things like Prison Architect, when you see those different games in that genre, Airport Simulator, these games heavily pick up off of ideas that were tried and tested in Dwarf Fortress. And a lot of developers have played Dwarf Fortress. They are wildly impactful games, but they're not seen. So he says this like this is an objective statement. But his own word is the problem with this statement. Seen. Seen. These games put the player into a specific path, guiding them along with plenty of sights in between the same old quest hugs, giving very little divergent paths, virtually no freedom in player progression. And the primary source of experience in Ashes of Creation will be through what they say is that there will be lots of ways to do it, but that when he said it would be primarily, his statement was primarily through grinding and questing. Now, getting experience from PvP, PvE, exploration, gathering, processing, crafting, events, but primarily through quests and grinding, is already how Final Fantasy levels, how World of Warcraft levels. That's already an existing way within most of theme park MMOs. And within sandbox MMOs like Guild Wars, it's the same list, but it's more evenly distributed. It's more evenly distributed. So people are excited about this game. And when I talk positively about this game, that's a good thing. But when I talk negatively, well, you don't know, it's not out yet. But I'm telling you the statements that Steven's making, the guy in charge. Recently, the MMO genre has seen some games in the sandbox nature come to the scene. He's saying recently, but despite the ultimate freedom the sandbox affords to players, many are left wanting more, as there is by definition no pre-built world content, no human touch, just the vastness of sand, for lack of a better term. No pre-built world. That sounds like you want some theme park in there. Guild Wars 2 released in what, 2012? I wouldn't define that as recent. I wouldn't define that as recent. So I do think there are games that have sand with pre-built content. EVE Online has its pre-built section for new players, but outside of that leans heavily into sandbox. So I would think of it more as a spectrum. And he's just really trying to navigate where he wants to be on the spectrum. And whether or not he feels alone in that position on the spectrum doesn't really matter. It's where is he choosing to be? Thus, many MMO players often, and he says MMO, not even MMORPG, so you would have to start, in my opinion, adding in games that are massively multiplayer online and maybe even do have a little bit of role-playing type. So I think games like Forza Horizon 5 are a great example of something to compare to this. Players find themselves caught between the repetitive rock of theme park or the vast spaces of sandbox hard place. Yes. Yes. Of course. Of course, it's very hard to create a ride with multiple outcomes. It's what, in theory, something like Final Fantasy XIV's variant tries to begin to bridge the gap. It's what, in theory, modified experiences such as the Mythic Plus system or Fractal system inside Guild Wars and World of Warcraft do. right? We have these mutators that take place on New World, where you take theme park content, you begin to put layers of modifications on it, so that every unique layer makes it feel like you're getting a unique experience. Because now I have the base content, the seed, and it's got, you know, choice 1 through 4, choice 1 through 4, choice 1 through 4, and so you've got these 16 versions of the same thing. Right? And so that starts to try to bridge that gap, but it's very hard. It's hard to do well. Because if you let it be too sandbox, you run the risk of people going in with a theme park experience and ending up with something that's not solvable. But if you keep it solvable, if you keep it wildly player or dev tested, it may not feel sandboxy enough. It may feel too curated, and at the end of 5, 10, 12 runs, you feel like you've seen everything. The chasm between the state of MMO gameplay loops, where we intend to inject caches creations node system, right in between theme park and sandbox. I don't have a problem with this. I'm excited about this game. But when I hear him talk, it feels like in general, it seems like he is saying that he's the only game in this space. That there is this spectrum. And at the top, in popularity alone, you have theme park MMOs. Right? These theme park MMOs. And so they are the largest and most visually available. They're what we see. They're exciting. Okay? And then we jump down here, and you have the less popular MMOs. The less popular games. The true sandbox experiences. They're out there, but it's very, very hard. D&D is not a wildly popular game for people to play. It's not. There are a lot of people that have played it, but not compared to the number of people that have played Monopoly. Right? Sandbox is just less popular. And if I go out and I try to meet somebody who's played a sandbox game, we don't always have something in common. As opposed to if I go meet somebody who's played Monopoly, we all had the exact same experience. So I think every game has a place, and you can move them around all you want. This doesn't matter. But the point is that it's always a spectrum, and his implication is that every other game is simple. There was a political thing done lately, as we approach the midterms in the United States, there was a political thing done lately where the average person in the United States feels that they are middle of the road, that they are 60% one party, 40% the other. They are a balanced and reasonable view. But that the people that decide opposite them are binary, are all one or all the other. I'm conservative, but I understand liberal things, but I have to defend conservative because the liberals are crazy. I'm pretty liberal, but I have some conservative leanings, but I have to defend liberal because the conservatives are crazy. That I'm the only one with a reasonable middle-of-the-road view. That EVE Online doesn't understand what it's like to give people curated experiences. That WoW doesn't understand what the importance of letting people be themselves. Everybody else is all up here, all the way. Everybody else is here and here. They're all problematic. And I just hate that because that leaves this huge gap. I am reasonable. I am reasonable. And it's just so hard to be a reasonable in this world where everybody else is so extreme. And more importantly, from his statement, most people, all the commercially ones I've seen, it's really just these two. Everybody else is up here. Everybody else is up here. There's a couple down here. But I am offering the unique experience. And World of Warcraft and Wrath of the Lich King used to be here, but now they're here. And that's why they're not popular anymore. The world used to be better back then. The world was better in my time. And this is a really easy thing to say when you haven't hit the publish button. It's really easy to say. Because you haven't had to do anything yet, right? In your head, if you pick up a paintbrush and paint, you have a beautiful painting in your mind, but execution is hard. And as other games have had to navigate these design pillars and what happens when you actually put them in game and you start to realize that you have to make choices sometimes to protect your engaging immersive story or make the world more reactive, you suddenly have to try to decide, oh crap, do I want my story, right? Do I want my story to be more theme park and controlled or more sandbox? And suddenly you have to decide, do I want my PvP to be more sandboxy or not? And what this ultimately means is theme park also means curated, and it means balanced, and it means tested. Do I want this to be a designated thing? Or do I want this to be player-driven, unbalanced, untested? This is the word player agency. And this is curated, and it's homogenized. And you get to choose. You get to choose. So maybe you want PvP to be all the way down here. Maybe you want story to be all the way up there. Maybe you want the leveling experience to be a little bit of a choice, but mostly I want to encourage you to do a certain type of leveling because I think it's the better experience. We're going to introduce you to more types of content. We're going to get you involved in the community. We're going to hold your hand and keep you from getting beat up on. We're going to penalize people from attacking low-level players more because we don't want your experience being ruined before you have a choice. Right? Maybe you want the economy to be a little more EVE Online, a little more all over the place, where things can break. And so every element of your game is on this spectrum. The game as a whole ends up just being an average. And so if you play all four of these things equally, you're dead in the middle. But if you're not an economy player, you shift upwards. If you're not a story player, you shift downwards. So every individual person's experience is going to vary. If you care about story, your immersive experience is going to drive up here, especially if you don't care about if you just care about, I just like leveling to cap in games and story. It was immersive, it was engaging, it was amazing. But it was also theme park, curated, homogenized, balanced, tested. I like making money. I like beating other players to the punch in the economy, and I like beating up on them in the world. I push escape through cutscenes, and leveling is just a required evil. I had an engaging and immersive experience down here. But are either of these players' experience more or less valid because the other one exists? Every game bounces along this. Every game. But they are looking at specifically having these big story arcs, this lore that's amazing. We're keeping lore very close to the chest because it's rich and diverse. It is a thing, a singular thing. It's not, I couldn't tell you the story because it's procedurally generated. It's rich, it's diverse. It's going to have applications outside of MMORPGs. It's going to change your life. We intend to take it much further. But I want it to be something players get to reveal, not just handed to them and the experience is lost. They should feel when they're experiencing it that this relates to them on a personal level. It's about mythology and discovering what truths mythologies are talking about and finding out what really happened on this world so long ago. That's part of the discovery process. Not just in terms of lore, but in the terms of the world itself. It's a direct thing. The Phoenix is a direct, persistent symbol throughout the entire first phase of the story. No matter what you do, this is part of this. Because the Phoenix is the celestial avatar of the goddess of creation. Not procedurally generated. They wrote that. They decided that. That's predetermined. There are religions. There are races. And they have a story predetermined, not by players, but by writers. So what's in making this engaging and immersive is absolutely not that it's procedurally generated, but that they are curating it. They're curating it. That shifts the game up. Their node system and the fact that it's player controlled shifts the game down. But it's along this spectrum, and every other game is. And my problem with Ashes of Creation is that people keep phrasing it like it's doing something that no other game's doing. And I think that does a disservice to them, I think it does a disservice to other games, and I think it does a disservice to Ashes of Creation. Because now if it doesn't do that by its very own scorecard, it's not doing good. A game can be good and not be inventing anything. He held up Wrath of the Lich King as this amazing moment in gaming. But back then, World of Warcraft was still heavily basing what it did off of what it learned from the rest of the industry. And it wasn't really doing any features within Wrath that weren't built off of what they did in the Burning Crusade. And it wasn't doing those on launch. It learned its way into Wrath of the Lich King through very clumsy learning in the base game. When we go look at the patches, before we even break down what's in the patches, when we go look at World of Warcraft through 1.0, 1.0 had its first patch a month in. Then 3 months later, they had a patch. 32 days later, they did one more patch. 60 days later, one more patch. 35, 63, 27, 85, 84, 84, 63. They had 12 patches. What's in a patch? Who knows? What should be in a patch? I don't know. What's a raid? What's a dungeon? I don't know. It was clumsy on launch. But it got better. When we moved into the Burning Crusade, they got themselves down to 3 patches. It became 4 patches. It became very clear what goes in a patch. It became very clear what goes in between a patch. Wrath of the Lich King dropped to 3. We're going to curate it even further. And every expansion since has targeted 3 patches. Their formula was learned. So by building these expectations, by setting these very high, they have to come out of the gate at a level of perfection that I just, had they not told me they were going to hit it, I would not expect. I would cut them the benefit of the doubt, just like I did New World. But I see regularly people like, but not limited to Narc, say that one of the great things about Ashes of Creation is it's not going to be the pile of dog crap that they want to call New World. But I think it's going to have a lot of the same problems as New World. It's going to have way too many servers on launch. The server merging is going to be a pain point. The login queues on launch is going to be a pain point. And ultimately, after people play way too many hours in the first month, they're going to realize that this is not that much variety, that people can create all sorts of guides on how to optimize this. And that the players who have the most knowledge will have a better experience than the players who have the least knowledge, because they will obtain their goals. The disparity will be enormous. You will have players that absolutely have tons of in-game wealth in whatever wealth is determined to be. Maybe that's map control, maybe that's number of characters leveled, maybe that's access to the best gear, maybe that's literal gold. But the meta will happen, and players will shift onto the meta, and maybe you won't. Maybe you individually are sticking to your guns. I just play what's fun for me. But you will be experiencing less of the game. You will be like, oh, I haven't even been into the newest dungeon because I can't clear that. So that's really my point with the procedural generation of Ashes of Creation, is that the procedural generation and the curated experience is being presented as if it's something new. And it's just not. It's combining things, right? We've never had a game that tries to be both Final Fantasy XIV and EVE Online at the same time. But if anything, I find that more of a red flag than a beacon. So when you promise to be all things, your quality tends to suffer. And so they are promising to combine things that are present in games, but they're promising to combine them to a degree that they do not believe the genre does. And either it does exist the way they're doing it, and they're just not aware of that. Like World of Warcraft players that didn't know the sky scale existed from Guild Wars 2. Or it doesn't exist and there's likely a reason.